If I had a nickel for every time a New England State Police agency completely botched the investigation into the disappearance of a young woman between the months of February and March 2004, I'd have 2 nickels. Which isn't a lot, but given how very specific that is, it truly is bizarre that it happened twice. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome to The Lord. For Fred Murray, March of 2004 was a difficult month. He spent every weekend in the Haverhill area, desperately searching for any leads which might breathe life into his daughter's case. And if that statement right there was confusing to you, it's because this is actually part 2 of our series on Maura Murray. Should I have written an introduction that made that clear? Probably, but I neglected to do so. So, if you don't know what I'm talking about, and you want to not be confused throughout this episode, which I totally understand, I would recommend going to the description, clicking the link to part 1, and watching that first, because while this video will make sense without doing that, there are some references I'm going to make that will be more clear if you watch part 1 first. Now, with that said, we are at the end of the month of March, which is really the first month and a half of this investigation. And as that month wound to a close, the eerily similar details of Brianna Maitland's disappearance just over 60 miles away in Vermont were beginning to make their way into the media. Like his own daughter, Brianna was a young and attractive brunette who disappeared from a rural highway after crashing her car on the wrong side of the road. Both girls had vanished without leaving any scent trail or footprints, and multiple witnesses passed by the cars without reporting anything to law enforcement. Neither Brianna nor Maura were present when police arrived on scene, and authorities towed both cars before a proper investigation of the area could be completed. But early in April, both the Vermont and New Hampshire State Police came together to issue a release stating that there was no connection between the two cases. Also early in April, on the 2nd, Fred Murray received a notice from the Haverhill Police Department. According to the Caledonian Record, Chief of Police Jeff Williams sent the determined father a letter informing him that his department had received a written request from area residents about repeated trespassing and parking problems on their properties, and explaining that, while they are sympathetic with the cause to find Maura, the right to quiet enjoyment of their personal property has been repeatedly and blatantly disregarded to the point that they now must insist that absolutely no one has permission to trespass on their properties. According to Williams, this was an order that Murray family members, friends, and relatives of Maura Murray, volunteer searches and canine handlers, private investigators, members of the press, and anyone else seeking clues or searching for Maura Murray were to stay off of private property or face arrest by his department. This letter came as a shock to the entire Murray camp. They had been asking for permission during all of their searches, and nobody had said a word to them in the month and a half since they'd begun their efforts. Sharon Rosh, the mother of Maura's boyfriend Billy, found the decision to send a letter rather than make a phone call offensive and callous, while Fred himself believed that the police had ulterior motives. So far, they hadn't looked great, and it was his opinion that the true intent of Williams' letter was that the police were trying to discourage any independent searches for Maura, and that it was an attempt to reduce the amount of publicity Maura's disappearance had been receiving. That opinion was bolstered shortly after the story made its way into the press on April 14th, because a week later on the 20th, another article came out regarding the issue of trespassing. In an article entitled "Residents Dispute Claims They Want Trespassers Arrested," the Caledonian Record reported that people living in the area where a 21-year-old University of Massachusetts at Amherst student went missing dispute police claims they filed complaints regarding the woman's father, relatives, and searchers. When asked by the Record, Chief Williams refused to say how many complaints were actually filed, or who had filed them, while Steve Loud of nearby McGuire Lane argued it's just the people down by the barn. The people down by the barn were the Westmans, who had admitted to the Record that they had indeed filed a complaint, and that the Murrays had never consulted them about checking their property. After 2 months, what are they looking for? Faith Westman asked. Have we not covered enough? As far as the Murrays and most of the Westmans' neighbors were concerned, the answer was no. Steve Loud told the paper that claims the neighbors living near the accident site had gathered together to file complaints with the Haverhill Police Department were not true, and that anyone looking for Maura was welcome to search his property. John Boutillier echoed that sentiment, telling the paper that he didn't care if people came on his land, and recognized that this was a stressful situation for Fred Murray. It makes you wonder if someone has something to hide, he added. Whether or not that was the case, the family felt that the local police and the New Hampshire State Police were either unwilling or unequipped to handle Maura's case, and at this point, they needed the assistance of the FBI if anything was to come of the search. And as it turned out, the FBI had already offered to join the hunt back in mid-February, only to be told that their offer was appreciated, but not necessary. The Murrays strongly disagreed, so on April 29th, Fred held a press conference at the Woodsville American Legion Hall in concert with Bruce and Kelly Maitland. Also present were the parents of Amy Riley, a 20-year-old woman whose body was found in a swamp earlier that month. Amy went missing in August of 2003 after leaving a bar in Manchester, New Hampshire, and despite the arguments from police that there was no connection between the three cases, all three families felt that the similarities between the disappearances and the fact that they crossed state lines warranted FBI assistance. As April turned into May, and May neared June, Fred Murray turned to the only authority with a chance to turn things around: the governor of New Hampshire. With the FBI unable to step in until they were either invited or until an official connection was made between the Vermont and New Hampshire disappearances, he wanted Governor Craig Benson to force the state police to bring the FBI in. The finest resource in the world is available, and you, sir, should direct Lieutenant John Scarinza and Troop F to accept its offer, Fred wrote, adding that there are corollary cases in Vermont also, and this entire situation begs for central coordination and investigation by an agency which is not bound by the confines of configuration of Grafton County and the Connecticut River. Lieutenant Scarinza, who was in charge of the state police effort, for his part disagreed. Acknowledging that the FBI was involved in the case on the Massachusetts side, he argued that the state police had enough resources to conduct the investigation without federal assistance, something that had not, to that point, proven to be the case. At every turn, New Hampshire authorities had at best failed to execute on their responsibilities, and at worst had stood in the way of any further efforts by volunteers. Murray drew Benson's attention to these facts as well, arguing that state police and Haverhill police had been grossly negligent because a cruiser was not dispatched east along Route 112 to help find his daughter after her accident. Police had arrived just minutes after Maura was last seen by a witness, meaning that she couldn't have gotten particularly far and was likely just up the road when Sergeant Smith got to the scene. And Fred Murray was not without reason to believe this was the case. Along with the direction of the scent trail found by the dogs, he had received word the day of that April 29th press conference that someone had seen Maura heading eastbound along that same road. That witness was named Rick Forcier, and he'd contacted Mr. Murray when he realized that he might have seen Maura on the night of her disappearance. He had been driving home from a contracting job in Franconia that night, and he recalled seeing a young woman matching her description running along Route 112, about 4 or 5 miles east of the scene of her accident. Police, as it happened, had already interviewed Forcier on February 19th, but at that time Forcier said nothing about this sighting, apparently because he thought it occurred 2 days after she disappeared. He told Fred Murray, however, that upon reviewing his records, he realized that he'd mixed up his dates during that first interview. If he had seen a young woman that night, it could have meant that Maura could have been recovered if someone had just bothered to drive east. She was figuratively and nearly literally right there, Murray's letter to the governor continued, readily available to be rescued and saved from whatever fate has befallen her. All that the police had to do was expend minimal mental and physical effort. The onus of this irresponsible and possibly fatal lack of action lies not only with the North Haverhill force, but also with the New Hampshire State Police, who responded to the 911 calls from the neighbors as well. As of the time the Caledonian Record published that article, Governor Benson's office stated that they'd yet to receive the letter. But according to Murray, the Postal Service tracking system showed that it had been delivered the day before they made that statement. Whether it was incompetence or deliberate neglect, authorities were failing it every step of the way, and Murray was growing tired of it. Whether the governor's office received this letter or not, their answer came in some form through their silence, and through a joint announcement by the Vermont and New Hampshire State Police Bureaus on June 8, 2004. After a day-long meeting with the FBI Tuesday, the Caledonian Record reported, the state-level agencies told the press that there was no connection between the disappearances. In a move that would infuriate both the Murray and the Maitland families, law enforcement then stated that Maitland had made several bad life choices before she disappeared, and at one point had been a runaway, while Murray had nearly cleaned out her bank account, packed up her belongings in her dorm room at UMass Amherst, and made off for destinations unknown. Both statements lacked the considerable nuance involved in both cases, and were clear attempts to blame the two missing women for whatever had happened to them. In reality, Both cases involved total failures of procedure by the responding officers. Now, Brianna Maitland had made poor decisions in her life. There's no argument to be made about that. However, she wasn't making those decisions on the night she disappeared. She had just left work and was heading home to get some sleep before an early morning shift at her second job. Her car was discovered by police the following day, but rather than report the abandoned vehicle, which showed clear signs of distress on the part of the driver, and investigate the situation, the responding state trooper had the car towed and then went on a long weekend vacation without breathing a word of it to anyone else in the office. Maura's case wasn't quite so egregious, but the fact that the responding officer chose to drive back the way he came to look for her, rather than checking the route he hadn't already followed, made the Haverhill PD and the New Hampshire State Police look horribly unprofessional, considering that a state trooper had arrived on scene just moments after the police did. Furthermore, in both cases, the vehicle was towed before an actual CSI team could arrive on site. And thanks to these failures, the investigations lost valuable time at crucially important moments and destroyed the scenes in the process. In response to the statements, Bruce Maitland pointed out that the authorities didn't have any evidence saying they aren't connected, and that the claims were almost character assassinations of the victims. He felt that the police were prematurely attempting to close both investigations by pitting the disappearances on runaway adults who didn't want to be found, and it's not hard to see why. Whatever the case, the Murray investigation changed directions soon after, when New Hampshire State Police showed up with a request for Maura's personal belongings. They had originally been returned to the family when the search was suspended in February, but as June rolled into July, something drove the police to seek a forensic examination of the items from Maura's car and dorm room. Along with what had been found in the car, they also confiscated her hard drive and the car itself, explaining that the state's Major Crimes Division was stepping in to oversee the case from that point on. Fred Murray wasn't pleased that they were only now taking over, but Lieutenant Scarinza made a point of telling the papers that major crimes weren't just stepping in for the first time. According to the Caledonian, he was emphatic that the items were not only now being looked at, and that major crimes had been involved in the Murray disappearance since 3 days after she disappeared. On the other hand, the paper reported that when asked whether any of the items, including clothing and books, had been analyzed for forensic evidence in the beginning of the investigation, he replied that you don't just send a bag of stuff down there. It seems he chose his language precisely because the items were certainly looked at when they were inventoried by the police. They just weren't properly examined by a forensics team. What they did know, based on the very limited scope of their investigation, was that something was missing from the car. In addition to the missing bottles of Bailey's, Kahlua, and vodka, Maura's black JanSport backpack had also disappeared, along with her cell phone and wallet. To police, this suggested that she left the scene of the accident voluntarily. If she did, they thought it might have something to do with the book Not Without Peril by Nicholas Howe, written about tragedies in the White Mountains, which was found in the back seat. And while explaining that they planned to hold all items for potential evidence later on, Scarinza said, for instance, is there something significant about the book? I don't know. Now, I don't know if you're aware of this, but every time you put your information online, like when you're trying out for a free trial or you're requesting information from somewhere, that data is probably going and being sold to a data broker, and that is what our partner Delete Me is here to help you with. And while a data broker having your information isn't the greatest thing, because you're definitely going to receive a lot of scam calls, texts, emails, even sometimes targeted advertisements that are going to make you question if you're being listened to, you are. The bigger problem is the threat of being harassed, doxxed, attacked due to publicly expressed opinions or political views, or your occupation, anything like that. If you've been looking around at the world recently, then you've probably noticed it's not a very good place to be. We're very much in a situation where you say, I like waffles, and people say, so you hate pancakes at the moment, and that can get dangerous. And on top of the ever-present threat of people who don't understand nuance, there's also the risk of identity theft and becoming the target of phishing scams. Identity theft is actually harder to avoid than you might think, and as I found out personally, your bank may not think anything of you paying for something at CVS in State College, Pennsylvania, and then somebody taking $1,000 out of your checking account with a debit card that's in your wallet somehow, 3 hours away in Plymouth Meeting. Now, phishing, of course, you should be able to avoid, but just in case you can't, or more importantly, in case your grandmother can't, Delete Me will help with that as well. And then, of course, on top of, the targeted harassment and the identity theft and the Nigerian princes, there is always the possibility of stalking. Now, are you going to be stalked by a Nigerian prince? Probably not, but you might be stalked by Creepy Jerry. Who's Creepy Jerry? I don't know. He's on the internet and therefore anonymous, and that's why Delete Me is here to help. Now, you might be asking, well, how does Delete Me help with Creepy Jerry, or the Nigerian prince, or somebody from the internet who thought that I am racist against pancakes? Well, the answer is that you give them your information and you say, hey, I don't want this information on the internet. And then they run an algorithm that trawls all of the data brokerage sites for that information, all the listing sites and whatnot, and then they file takedown requests. And you might be thinking, well, why can't I file the takedown request on my own? You can, but you have to manually do that with hundreds upon hundreds of websites. And then if that information comes up for sale again because you wanted to try another free trial, they'll just slap it right back on there. So basically, you have to just keep on requesting this constantly over and over and over and over again, and that becomes rather stressful and time-consuming, so why not just pay Delete Me a little bit of money to do it for you? Now, I will tell you, as somebody who is something of a public figure and therefore deals with threats of stalking, harassment, and of course the pancake people, I do worry, and that's why I use Delete Me, to make sure that I am as unfindable as possible and that, I don't have to resort to more violent methods of self-defense. So, if you would like to make it harder for the Nigerian prince, the pancake person, or your local Creepy Jerry to find you, you can get 20% off Delete Me consumer plans when you go to joindeleteme.com/lorelodge and use promo code LORELODGE at checkout. Once again, that is joindeleteme.com/lorelodge, code LORELODGE at checkout. I don't know seems like it could be the slogan for the Maura Murray investigation, but there are reasons to believe that the investigators knew more than they were letting on. Not least among them was the refusal to accept potential evidence even when it was literally being handed to them. On one occasion in late 2004, Fred Murray went to state police headquarters with a stained rusty jackknife, which he'd received from a man who believed his own brother might be connected to the disappearance. However, when Fred tried to hand it over, he reportedly did not get beyond the plate glass window. According to the Whitman-Hanson Express, Fred recalled telling the dispatcher, "I have what could be evidence in a capital crime," only to be told that no one was available at headquarters to accept such evidence. Instead, he was told to come back during regular work hours, though he opted to mail the evidence instead, along with a full explanation of how he'd come to possess it. Given that Fred Murray did not live in central New Hampshire, this is a reasonable thing to do. And the police indeed confirmed receipt of the package, but they never reached out about it. If that weren't enough, late 2004 also saw yet another revelation about the total incompetence of the investigation. Unwilling to give up just because the police had, the Murrays and Roshes had continued the search on their own, and that led them to reach out to Dominic and Linda Salamone in Bartlett, New Hampshire. Maura had called them on the day she disappeared, ostensibly to inquire about renting their condo, and the families hoped the couple might have some information regarding what Maura's plans were on that fateful day. But when Sharon Rosh called them in October, she was shocked to learn that she was the first person to reach out to them about the disappearance. Despite being some of the last people to speak to Maura on the day she went missing, police had never bothered to interview them. "It blew our minds," Sharon told the Patriot Ledger, "that it's now 8 months later and we're finding out the police never even called these people." As the revelations of investigative inadequacy mounted, the Murrays reached a breaking point in their relationship with law enforcement, and they abandoned any hope that the authorities would do the right thing. But Fred made one final appeal to the new governor, John Lynch, on the first anniversary of his daughter's disappearance. On February 9, 2005, he headed to Concord, New Hampshire in the hope of meeting with the new executive. He was only able to speak with the governor for about 10 minutes, but Fred had planned for that sort of outcome. As a backup, he'd written a letter explaining what had happened and why he needed assistance, and unlike last time, he made sure to hand it directly to the man who most needed to read it. In that letter, Fred Murray excoriated the astonishingly careless, go-through-the-motions response of the New Hampshire State Police, as well as their unnaturally steadfast refusal to communicate on the matter since. He outlined their failures in detail, including not questioning neighbors who live 100 yards from and in sight of the accident scene until 10 days had passed, and the fact that they only did so because the Murrays demanded it after calling those people themselves. Not even the fact that their tracking dog lost Maura's scent squarely before these properties, one of which was owned by the last person who talked to Maura, and another by the last person to actually see her, he wrote in a fury, was enough to provoke the most elementary of basic investigatory technique. Fred pulled no punches regarding his beliefs about the reality of the situation, writing that law enforcement's decision on this case from its inception has been to insist that you can take your pick of 3 possible happenstances: self-delete for the purpose of YouTube, runaway or hypothermia victim, but not consider the 4th, which is the probability rather than the possibility, that is, that a bad guy grabbed her and they can't catch him. Beyond basic incompetence, Fred Murray even accused the state police of deliberately misleading the public, explaining how, in order to support their diversion, the commander of Troop F twice stated during a television appearance in Boston that Maura wrote a final letter to her boyfriend and left it in a prominent place in her dormitory room. As far as Fred was concerned, this was an attempt to suggest the traditional goodbye letter, when in reality she never wrote or left such a letter at all, something he said police were fully cognizant of at the time. The pattern certainly doesn't indicate adherence to accepted and recommended police procedure, he continued, adding that, to date, the high law enforcement officials in Concord have reacted like ostriches to this pseudo-investigation. Finally, as a last blow to the investigators, he pointed out that their incompetence was only made worse by the fact that, even with it being so obvious that they lacked the ability to solve the case on their own, they remained determined to not accept the offer of meaningful participation extended by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He finished the letter with a plea to Governor Lynch, writing, "You represent my final hope to help my little girl. I pray you will regard reacting favorably to my entreaty not so much as your legal obligation, but as a parent, your moral responsibility." If Governor Lynch ever read the letter, then it seems he was unmoved. Though he told Fred Murray that he would look into the situation, the desperate father met with the same resistance as always when he met with New Hampshire authorities a month later. There would be no release of files, no reclassification of the case, and no acceptance of FBI assistance. Fred Murray held out hope for the remainder of the year, but when nothing changed, he had only one option left if he hoped to force some kind of movement. On December 29, 2005, he sued the involved agencies for access to their case files, arguing that if the investigation has concluded, then he should be made aware of that fact, and any records should be turned over to him so he can continue searching for information in the hopes of finding Maura. As far as he was concerned, the fact that Maura could be in danger was a compelling reason for requiring the respondents to disclose the records. The Grafton County Superior Court, located in North Haverhill, Haverhill, I had like 8 different ways of pronouncing this given to me in the comments. We have places nearby that are Haverford and Havertown. That's why I've been saying Haverhill, but I guess it's Haverhill or Haverhill. I'll go with Haverhill, try to make everybody happy. Anyway, the Grafton County Superior Court, located in North Haverhill, wasted no time in responding to this lawsuit, and on January 26, 2006, they issued their decision. They acknowledged that Murray's argument was based upon 2 suppositions: that law enforcement authorities have characterized Maura's case as a missing persons matter and not a criminal investigation, and that the investigation does not appear to be ongoing. Despite both of these suppositions being accurate to the facts, his request was categorically denied under the reasoning that the records sought by the petitioner are investigatory in nature and have been compiled for law enforcement purposes, and therefore should be exempt from disclosure because production of the records would clearly interfere with enforcement proceedings. All of this was based upon the court's claim that this was an ongoing criminal investigation in which no arrests have been made, once again despite the fact that law enforcement repeatedly refused to reclassify the case as a criminal investigation and that they were not actively investigating any leads, new or old. To add insult to injury, they argued that they came to this conclusion due to Murray's insistence that foul play had not been ruled out, rather than any official classification of the case as criminal in nature. Murray's lawyer, Timothy Irvin, found all of that preposterous, and in particular the claims about classification. They can't just, with a broad stroke, say everything's exempt, Irvin told the press. This is a missing persons case. It's not a criminal investigation. In essence, they couldn't just claim it was a missing persons case to get out of investigating, and then turn around and claim it was a criminal investigation to avoid disclosure. He further explained that somewhere in the stacks of 2,500 pages of records may be a phone number, an email address, or a name that stuck out to Maura's father in ways that would not catch the attention of the police, and that all they wanted was to add to what the police have done and see if we can find something new. Irvin then appealed the case to the New Hampshire Supreme Court, who proceeded to hand down a demand for a re-examination of the issue a few months later, and this led to an evidentiary hearing back in Grafton in April. Unfortunately, Judge Vaughn once again sided with the police, stating that even partial disclosure could reasonably be expected to interfere with law enforcement proceedings. As for what proceedings he was talking about, it was a little bit difficult to say. Despite the fact that there were no suspects in the case, New Hampshire Assistant Attorney General Jeff Strelzin testified that there was a 75% likelihood of prosecution, and therefore the release of records could jeopardize their non-existent case. Fred Murray, rightfully in my opinion, felt that this was a complete charade and that the reality was simple. They didn't do what they were supposed to do, and they've been covering up ever since. If the police were looking for a way to prove that Fred was right, it came in October of that same year, when Fred received a tip about a home on Valley Road, about a mile from the scene of the accident. After obtaining permission to search the property from the real estate agent overseeing its sale, he brought in a volunteer canine team from the New Hampshire League of Investigators. According to the Express, their cadaver dog hid on the second floor, and when they brought in another set of 4 cadaver dogs the next day, they went bonkers outside of a closet on the first floor. The private volunteer search team bagged a number of items indicated by the dogs and even took a sample of the carpet, and then they turned everything over to the state police. But according to private investigator John Healy, police were not at all interested in the evidence and would not take the carpet into their possession. Now, if you look at the Wikipedia page for this case, there is an interesting conundrum. Their version of the story has an update regarding this house, which says that in April of 2019, an excavation was done in that house after ground-penetrating radar revealed something buried under the basement. However, the articles it cites for this don't seem to be about the same house referenced in the Whitman-Hanson Express and other contemporary coverage. Instead, it would seem that they're describing a second home, about which Fred received a tip early on in the case. According to a CBS News report, Fred had tried on multiple occasions to get access to this house in the years between Maura's disappearance and the article's publication in February of 2019, but the homeowners had denied him access every time. It was only after the property changed hands in 2018 that Fred was able to go in and do some digging. Considering that none of the more recent articles describing this house mention the 2006 search, that the 2018 house was described as astonishingly close to the crash site as compared to about a mile away, and that the later articles make no mention of hits upstairs, it seems possible that these are 2 different properties rather than 2 separate investigations of the Valley Road house. Either way, the tip Fred Murray received was very specific. A body had been buried in the basement shortly after Maura disappeared. In 2018, after receiving permission to do a sweep, 2 separate cadaver dogs hid on a spot in the basement, and ground-penetrating radar confirmed there was some sort of disturbance underneath the concrete flooring. Even for the ever-incompetent New Hampshire State Police, that kind of evidence was too much to ignore. So, in March 2019, they set out their own team of 2 cadaver dogs to search the basement. Jeff Strelzin told Boston.com that the state police felt there was certainly no probable cause to do so, and that it was really done to just cross something off the list, which aren't statements that inspire confidence in their efforts when you really think about it. It's not totally clear what the police search involved, but CBS reported in April of 2019 that they received permission from the new homeowners to dig up a small area of concrete in the basement, and that Strelzin said the private searcher's ground-penetrating radar had detected disturbed ground, not a body. Boston.com added that officials found absolutely nothing other than what appears to be a piece of pottery or old piping. With that, the lead was dismissed, at least by the police. Fred Murray, on the other hand, wasn't so sure he agreed with their assessment. It was his opinion that the police had dug in the wrong place, and that he wasn't satisfied they got anywhere close enough to the corner where the private dogs had indicated something was buried. "This one hurts because I thought we finally had it," he told CBS. "This one was worse than the other false alarms or dead ends. I was pretty sure based on what I heard and who the people were and other things I've heard about them." And that particular statement caught my attention, as did something written in the Boston.com article. Fred Murray said he believes his daughter is dead, and that the man who lived in the house at the time of the crash and his nearby extended family members were responsible. I believe I've tracked down the exact home in question, but unfortunately I've hit a dead end in identifying who owned it prior to 2018. Even if I were able to confirm that information, however, I wouldn't be able to share it for privacy reasons. Not because it would be illegal, but because it just probably wouldn't be the most appropriate thing to do. I just want to say that if I do turn out to be right about it, it will not be the first time that this has happened. But anyway, unless police agree to perform a full excavation and to finally treat this as a criminal investigation, nobody will be able to say for certain that the house holds no secrets. It has now been nearly 20 years since Jeff Strelzin said there was a 75% chance of prosecution in the Maura Murray investigation, and in that time, not one suspect has been publicized. Not one piece of evidence has been uncovered, not one example of good police work has emerged. All that has been done has been achieved by volunteers, and through the sheer force of will coming from Fred Murray, who to this day maintains a belief that his daughter met with foul play. He's not alone in that belief either, even as the New Hampshire authorities and others, like author James Renner, argue for various reasons that she chose to leave of her own accord. On the other hand, there are many who agree with Fred that someone local to the crash site abducted Maura, while others have come forward with theories that she was either lured there or chosen as a target of opportunity by someone traveling through the region. And in that case, the big question is who? Brianna Maitland case PI Greg Overacker thinks he may know the answer to that, and it's one that does fit with Renner's hypothesis, at least to some extent. In our video on Brianna's case, we briefly went over Greg's theory that a serial killer may have been responsible for both the disappearances of Maura and Brianna in 2004. And while he never outright says the name of this alleged murderer, he's heavily implied that it is the same man who was convicted for the death of Michelle Gardner Quinn in October of 2006. Like Brianna, she lived in northern Vermont, where she attended UVM. And like Maura, Michelle was a 21-year-old college student who was last seen on October 7th when she went out for dinner with her parents before meeting up with friends for some drinks. After leaving the bar to head back to her residence, Overacker writes that she borrowed a phone from a stranger on the street to call a friend, someone she had gotten separated from. This man was Brian Rooney, who later answered Michelle's phone when that friend, Tommy Lang, called her back. Tommy later told reporters that Rooney said something to the effect of, "I guess you want to speak with this beautiful brunette standing next to me." As you can imagine, it did not take long for authorities to charge Brian Rooney for the murder of Michelle Gardner Quinn. Security camera footage from a jewelry store caught Brian and Michelle walking together around 2:30 that morning, and when Michelle's body was recovered from a crevice in Huntington Gorge on October 13th, he became the prime suspect. Forensic evidence, and in particular DNA analysis, linked him to the assault almost immediately, and by October 25th, he was set to stand trial. He was already in custody for another unrelated sexual offense after being arrested the same day teenage hikers found Michelle's remains, and in March of 2008, a jury convicted him of first-degree murder. His lawyer put up a valiant defense, arguing that the state's case lacked witnesses to the abduction and killing, and hinged on 2 nanograms of sperm handled by a forensic lab with a history of sloppy work. But the jury wasn't having it. The judge wasn't either, and openly referred to a teary-eyed Rooney as the lowest of the low during sentencing. He later appealed, his new lawyer arguing that there was no proof that the victim had died on the night she was assaulted, and therefore the DNA evidence could not be used to prove that Rooney was responsible for her murder. But the Vermont Supreme Court stood by the decision of the lower court. Brian Rooney is currently serving life without parole, and given his history of abuse towards not only adult women, but also young girls, that's exactly what he deserves, if not more. Aiden, for entirely unrelated purposes that, for legal reasons, have nothing to do with Brian Rooney, can you please place an image of a wood chipper on screen and make the sound, somehow, of a wood chipper? Unrelated, of course. All of that business aside, the question is, could he be responsible for the disappearances of Maura and Brianna? There are certainly a good number of commonalities between the victims, something that profilers refer to as victimology. All 3 were attractive, young, white women with dark hair. All 3 were in some form of distress when they were last seen. Maura and Brianna had just been in car accidents, and Gardner Quinn had become separated from her friends late at night. One of the most difficult parts about connecting the cases would be geography, but Rooney worked construction and traveled frequently. He'd once committed an assault in St. Johnsbury, Vermont, which is generally in the middle of the Murray, Maitland, and Quinn disappearances, and at the time of his arrest for the slaying of Gardner Quinn, he was under investigation for another attack in Caledonia County, just east of Burlington. It would appear that he lived in East Concord in 1998, and in 2006, the New York Times reported that he was living in Richmond, Vermont, not far from the Huntington Gorge. And while I've been unable to confirm it, a Reddit post also links him to the Mountain Lakes neighborhood of Woodsville, New Hampshire in 2004, which is precisely the area where Maura disappeared. Leaving aside the unconfirmed information from Reddit, Brian's familiarity with northern Vermont and the itinerant nature of his job means that the geography actually does make a lot of sense. The bigger question is how he would have met Brianna and Maura, considering they both disappeared in very rural areas compared to Michelle. Overacker has a theory for that one too, and it's not a bad one. Brianna, he suggested, may have met Rooney at one of her two jobs, either in Montgomery or St. Albans, Vermont. Of the two, the St. Albans one is the more likely, mainly because she was a server there while she worked in the back as a dishwasher at the other. And while I typically don't trust books at face value, at least not without other evidence that corroborates what's in them, Overacker actually has a very good reputation as a PI and had explicit permission and even encouragement from the family when writing his book, unlike James Renner, who we'll be getting to in a moment. And I bring this up because one thing he says at the end of his work is that in the days prior to Brianna's disappearance, she had told a close friend that she'd met an older man at work. The friend seemed to believe that she was talking about the Black Lantern Inn, where she was washing dishes, but Overacker wonders if she might have been mistaken about which job Brianna was talking about. If that man were Rooney, it could be possible that she had told him about her job at the Black Lantern, and that on the night she disappeared, he was lying in wait for her. Brianna was on a predictable path home from work and had a reasonably rigid schedule if someone were looking to ambush or otherwise intercept her. Personally, I don't think that necessarily explains several of the other circumstances surrounding Brianna's disappearance, but I can't say that it's impossible. And I would like to have Overacker on the live show to talk through it, but I've yet to hear back from him about an appearance. When it comes to Maura, however, I'm not so sure that I like this explanation at all. Major flaw with Overacker's hypothesis, in my opinion, is with regard to why Maura was there in the first place. She wasn't walking along a road in her college town, and she wasn't driving a predictable route on her way home from work. She was in the middle of nowhere, in a place that wasn't part of the printed out routes found in her car, or in the searches she'd made the night before. And so far as investigators and the FBI could tell, she hadn't contacted anyone to say where she was going. Unlike Brianna and Michelle, she wasn't living in Vermont or New Hampshire, and so far as I can tell, none of Rooney's known victims were in the Granite State. The only way I can imagine Rooney could have come across Maura is if he was in fact living in Mountain Lakes at the time, and I don't see any evidence that he was. So what does that mean? If Maura wasn't a victim of Brian Rooney, then why was she in New Hampshire, and how did she disappear? As we've already established, the New Hampshire State Police will tell you that she intended to go missing, either to get away from her life or to end it on her own terms. But they've never been able to explain why she might have done either of those things. This is where James Renner comes in. A self-proclaimed gonzo journalist, Renner is the author of the 2016 book True Crime Addict: How I Lost Myself in the Mysterious Disappearance of Maura Murray. It's a book that Renner actively acknowledges he was explicitly asked not to write, and one that is written in a very self-centered, oddly autobiographical way. That said, it is filled with interviews that allegedly involve people Maura knew in various aspects of her life, and they form the basis of Renner's arguments. Now, he wrote an entire book, so I'll have to do a fair bit of summarizing here, and I think the best way to do that is by starting with his conclusion and then working backwards through his reasoning. Simply though, Renner thinks Maura had several reasons to leave her life behind, and that her disappearance was a carefully orchestrated attempt to get away before anyone even knew she was missing. In the 60th chapter of a book that really didn't need more than 25 of them, James Renner tells the story of a 2013 trip he made to Quebec, Canada, as he and some associates followed up on several tips suggesting Maura had been seen there. One came from an April 8, 2009 post on the website Topics, where a user on the Amherst page posted a message reading, "I saw Maura Murray alive and well in Sherbrooke, Quebec. I approached her and said, 'Hi, Maura.' She turned toward me and said, 'Hi,' then gasped and looked like she was going to pass out from shock. I have no doubt this is Maura Murray. She is apparently alive and well and living in Canada. When I saw her, she was with a very handsome young man." In a shocking coincidence, another user posting in the section for the Canadian village of Saint-Étienne de Barboina, or Barb... I don't care, it's French. Spell it right and I'll pronounce it right. Spell things how you want them to be pronounced. This goes for you too, Massachusetts. And New Hampshire, really all of you. Be better. Anyway, someone in the Canadian village of Seromnehu posted about Maura on the exact same day, that comment reading, "Maura Murray was seen in Quebec City, Quebec Province. She is alive and well. Very well. Her new squeeze is a hunk." Before going any further, I think it's important to point out a couple things about those statements. First, the phrase alive and well is used in both, and then both mentioned that she was with an attractive man, one of them rather more enthusiastically than the other. The shared phrasing and the repetition of the romantic themes stand out to me, and would suggest that both posts were either made by the same person, or that one was based upon the other. The first, according to Renner, was posted from a computer in Brockton, Massachusetts, while the second came from one in Houston, Texas. But that could mean someone in Brockton was using a VPN to mask their identity as being in Houston. Alternatively, topics may have allowed users to self-designate their location, making it even easier for someone with two different accounts to post from two different places. All of this is to say that I'm a little bit skeptical about the authenticity of the sighting. I would have gone back and checked for myself, but Topics is now defunct. Of course, these aren't the only posts pointing to Maura being in Quebec, as Renner notes both in his book and on his blog. Perhaps the most famous and the most detailed was a message posted to a GeoCities page in 2009, which also alleged Maura was living in Canada at that time. The post is relatively short, so I'll go through it in full before we dive into the claims that it made. Maura Murray is not a missing person, it read. Maura Murray has the right, as every independent adult does, to leave with her new boyfriend and start a new life. Maura is living a content and satisfying life in the province of Quebec. According to the post, Maura's home life wasn't as positive as reporting had suggested. The author claimed that Fred Murray never quite forgave her for being asked to leave West Point, and that her being effectively kicked out bruised his ego beyond repair. It was his criticism, the post alleged, that led to Maura's decision to run away in favor of a new life unencumbered by the constant criticism of her father. Additionally, the author claimed that Maura's relationship with William Roche was near its end, and that, according to Maura's sister Kathleen, they were having serious problems. Maura had also allegedly met someone new, who, unlike William Roche, had no West Point connections, and therefore was not a constant reminder to her of her failure at West Point. There's already a lot to unpack here, but that's not even the real bombshell of the post, which goes on to say that on the night of February 5th, 2004, Maura took a break from her job at the security desk at a UMass dormitory to go and briefly get coffee and some food, and that sometime between 12 midnight and 1 a.m., Maura, driving her Saturn, struck and critically injured the UMass student Petrit Vasi, leaving him for dead. Now, this was not the first time that someone suggested a connection between Maura's disappearance and the hit and run of this student. The Whitman-Hanson Express published an article about it in June of 2007, but we'll come back to that in a second. The post continues, reading around 1 a.m. to 1:20 a.m., February 6th, Maura had a complete emotional breakdown brought on by this hit-and-run accident, which was witnessed by a student who reported this to Maura's supervisor, who then came and saw that Maura needed physical help to get back to her dormitory. From there, we have a time jump to the morning of February 8th, when Maura was involved in the accident in her father's car. The author claims that the car was towed to his motel room in Hadley, and then goes on to make some rather severe allegations about what happened that night. Fred was not happy with Maura, to put it mildly, the post reads, adding that, what happened in this motel room we'll never know, but I do know for a fact that there was some physical violence on the part of Fred Murray. Fred Murray has a history of domestic violence. The next day, Maura left for good. Again, we will come back to that because this doesn't get any less convoluted as it goes on. According to the author, Maura's crash in New Hampshire was deliberate, and for the purpose of disguising the evidence that she'd hit Vasi several nights prior. To that end, she and her new boyfriend traveled in tandem to Route 112 in New Hampshire, the author noting that he was already in southern New Hampshire, and once there, they staged the accident. Once the car was wrecked, she allegedly left it behind and walked a short ways down the road to where her boyfriend was waiting in his own vehicle. She disappeared, the letter concludes. Her only wish is that she be left alone to live her life in peace. She is happy and contented and just wants to be left alone. It's a very detailed explanation, and one that certainly does make a good argument for Maura staging her own disappearance, but there are some major problems. First of all, while Vasi's incident was at one point suggested as a possible connection, the Express pointed out that in order for Maura to have been responsible, she would have needed to somehow leave work, get to her car, drive downtown, and return all without any supervisor noticing that she'd left. There's also no surveillance footage showing Maura leaving the building, nor any evidence that she was involved in the crash. Put simply, it's pure speculation to say that she was involved, but that's not the biggest issue with the narrative. And I do want to say that whoever wrote this is a little suspicious to me, but we don't know who wrote it. But going back to the issues with this narrative, according to Julie Murray, Maura's West Point graduate sister, Maura was never asked to leave the academy. In a 2023 TikTok video, Julie explained the situation as it actually occurred, explaining that she got in trouble for taking some makeup and was sent to an honor board to determine her punishment, but that the punishment was not adjudicated before the time she decided to leave. "Now, I am a graduate of West Point and know how this process works," Julie continued. "I have friends who did far worse and weren't kicked out." She went on to say that sometimes you're sent to a regular army unit as an enlisted soldier for 6 months to a year and then readmitted, and that Maura's decision to leave of her own accord was informed by the ongoing wars in Afghanistan and Iraq rather than any request from the military itself. Was Fred disappointed in her? Probably a little bit, but there's no evidence that he became consistently abusive over the issue. If anything, the fact that he made a point of visiting Maura in Amherst once a month suggests that their relationship was just as good as everyone in her family claimed it was, and that this anonymous user posting the story is simply not a better source than her own immediate relatives and friends. As for the claim that he had a history of domestic abuse, there's just no evidence of that whatsoever. It is completely out of left field. There's also the issue of the claim that she had told her other sister, Kathleen, that she and Billy Rausch were having relationship troubles. It's hard to say where that line of thinking originated, but one possibility is that it was the result of a misreading of a March 2nd, 2004 article in the Boston Globe. That piece contains a line about the phone call, which cites Fred Murray as saying Maura's sister called her to talk about a monstrous fight with a boyfriend. It took Kathleen a while to come forward with any details about that conversation, but in 2017, she finally broke her silence in the Oxygen Network's documentary series on the case. As it turns out, Kathleen had just been released from a rehab facility shortly before their call, and told Maura that night that she had begun drinking again. In the same interview with Maggie Frayling, Kathleen also confirmed that she was not aware of any problems between Maura and her boyfriend, so that's another point against the authenticity of the post. One last piece, which I can't totally wrap my head around, is the use of 12 MN rather than 12 AM. It's not something that most people would use, which suggests that whoever wrote this post was accustomed to using non-standard notation in their writing. From what I can tell, MN is sometimes used by medical professionals, but it's also standard notation in places like the Philippines. It's definitely a hint as to the identity of whomever wrote the post, but without further information, it's hard to say what it means. Now, Renner makes an argument that this post is potentially authentic because an accountant claimed that someone who commented on it had an IP address that traced to Taunton, Massachusetts, which was the same place that another profile on a different website with an entirely different username was also posting from, and the accountant had heard from someone else that the second username belonged to someone who was related to Maura, which is not exactly the most bulletproof argument that I've ever come across. It's kind of like saying he heard it from her father's brother's nephew's cousin's former roommate, if you will. Regardless, Renner felt that this post, combined with the two topics posts, warranted a trip to Canada. A stop in Sherbrooke, which he described as similar in scale to State College, Pennsylvania, of all places, saw him and his associates meet with a gym worker who said she believed she'd seen someone matching a photo of Maura 3 weeks prior, but also that she hadn't seen the woman since. Another young woman, a barista at a coffee shop in town, also saw a resemblance and said that Maura may have come in before. They then made a quick trip to Saint-Étienne, but upon realizing it was basically just an intersection with a candy store, they turned back for Sherbrooke. The next day, they headed to Quebec City to investigate the second sighting claim, and it was there that Renner met his next witness. She was a punk named Roxanne who worked the desk at a vintage album store called Le Knockout, I'm not kidding, and while she wasn't able to communicate with Renner particularly well at the time, she did take a flyer about Maura and then reached out about a week later via email. Two of us maybe saw Maura Murray in Quebec on Monday, December 2nd and Saturday, December 7th, it read. We speak with a girl who looks like the one you're looking for. The similitude with pictures are so intense, and her speech was weird. I think you have my phone number. Given that people from Massachusetts do have an objectively silly accent, the part about her having weird speech actually does make this a little bit more compelling. But that alone isn't enough to confirm that she'd seen Maura, and Renner knew that. Hoping for more information, he wrote back, and soon after received another email with further details. According to Roxanne, the woman she'd seen looked quite a bit like Maura, but older, around 34. In late 2013, Maura would have been about 31, so that makes sense. Roxanne went on to explain that one of her English-speaking friends was with her when she saw the woman on Monday, the 2nd of December, and that he had spoken with the potential Maura. She had come into the record store and asked them where she could go for live music in Quebec City on a Monday night, and seemed disappointed when they told her there was likely nothing until Thursday or Friday. She told them she wouldn't be there by then, but then on Saturday, Roxanne saw her again, something which Roxanne said clashed her, but I can only assume that this was an attempt to communicate confusion. While in the store on Monday, she spent about 15 minutes talking with Roxanne and her friend, during which time she acted a little weird. Precise details aren't given, but apparently she wanted to go to a small show rather than a larger venue. In addition to those tidbits, this woman who might be Maura also seemed to suggest that she traveled frequently, and she refused to take a map of Quebec City venues when offered, with the explanation that in Quebec City, people do not know their town, not like other places that she supposedly travels. Roxanne clarified that this woman spoke in terms of I and not we, that her winter clothes were on the cheaper side and not meant for outdoor sports, and that when she saw her on Saturday, she wasn't wearing makeup. As for the resemblance, Roxanne was so sure that it was a match with the pictures she was shown that she reached out to the New Hampshire State Police, but as usual, nothing came of that. Now granted, I can't imagine a less effective police pairing than the New Hampshire State Police and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, but the fact that they didn't try is still upsetting. Leaving aside the sad state of missing persons investigations north of Pennsylvania, if Renner didn't make all of that up, and remember, he's not exactly the most reputable sort of reporter, then it's certainly a bit more compelling. On the other hand, while Maura was a very attractive woman, she was not particularly unique in her appearance. She was a 5'7" brunette with an athletic build, and there are quite literally millions of women just like that in North America. Given how strong the power of suggestion is and how malleable memories can be, it's impossible to say if Roxanne really saw Maura, or if her brain just made her believe that a similar-looking woman was a closer match than she really was. If she'd seen the picture and then later identified Maura on her own, it might be a different story, but the order of events leaves me skeptical of the accuracy of Roxanne's memory. All of that said, even if Maura wasn't in Quebec, and even if the sightings were completely bogus, that doesn't mean she didn't leave of her own accord. The question is, if that is what happened, what drove her to that decision? Renner offers a few more explanations, one of which is that her relationship with Billy Roche really wasn't all that great, and that, as the GeoCities post suggested, she was running away from her relationship with him. In True Crime Addict, Renner cites an interview with Maura's aunt Janice, who allegedly told him that Billy cheated on Maura for years with one of her sister Julie's girlfriends. Usually I wouldn't be so quick to question the word of a close relative, but other things Janice said bothered me. She spoke poorly of Fred Murray, referring to him as a very odd duck who had pursued Maura's mother Lori when she was just 15 and he was a college student. And while that does appear to be the case, it's worth noting that Fred was born in 1943 and Lori in 1947. Today, a 19-year-old dating a 15-year-old would rightfully raise eyebrows, but in the 1960s it was considerably less controversial. That, however, is not the only thing that made me question Janice's perspective. Fred had a habit of taking Maura on camping trips, something that would suggest a strong bond between father and daughter. Janice, on the other hand, took issue with it. I always thought that was strange, Maura going camping up there with her father, she told Renner. They would share a tent. She was what, 14, 15, 16? If my dad had ever asked me to go camping alone with him and share a tent, I would have said, "What are you, nuts?" I can only assume that Janice didn't spend a ton of time camping, because unless you have other reasons to believe someone is a predator, this is just an absolutely insane thing with which to find an issue. Maura was considerably safer sharing a tent with her father, who could protect her from an intruder, than she was sleeping alone in a separate shelter. Janice also seemed to take some shots at Julie Murray, as she told Renner that after Maura went missing, Julie traveled up to help with the search only once. Which makes complete sense considering Julie was an active duty officer in the Army at the time. She couldn't just take time off the way a civilian can. Both she and Billy had to request leave and were only granted so much time. Janice, meanwhile, said she'd never been involved in any searches herself. Regardless, it was Janice's opinion that Maura went up to New Hampshire to get away from Fred after they argued over her crashing his brand new car. He really reamed her over it, Janice said, before saying that she thought the police were behind Maura's disappearance from the crash site in New Hampshire. Now, how Janice knew the details of Fred and Maura's conversation the night before she vanished is completely unexplained. The only people there were Fred and Maura, so it's actually impossible that she could know anything unless Fred told her. And it doesn't seem like he was communicating with his ex-wife's sister all that much. To Renner's credit, he didn't just take Janice at her word. He tracked down two of the last people to see Maura alive, her friends Sarah Alfieri and Kate Markopoulos, but they refused to speak with him. So he did the next best thing he could think of, and began reaching out to Maura's teammates from the UMass Track Association. Apparently, they had some very unpleasant things to say, but not necessarily just about Billy. One teammate, Nastaran Shams, did allegedly tell Renner that Maura complained of Billy cheating on her, but also implied Maura may not have been entirely innocent herself. While Nast stopped short of saying Maura cheated on her boyfriend, she did imply that something might have been going on with their assistant coach, Hussein Baghdadi. Renner claims to have tracked him down too, and though he expected Baghdadi to deny a relationship, he did precisely the opposite. According to Renner, the man fully owned up to sleeping with Maura, but he didn't stop there. Maura Murray was a very promiscuous woman, he said. I wasn't the only guy on the team that she had slept with. This was apparently corroborated by several other members of the team, one of whom claimed to have had first-hand knowledge of after-hour parties at the athletic pool with 3 select upperclassmen. You can infer from there what the rest of the story was, but I'm really not interested in peddling rumors with zero backing to them. Maybe if Renner had named names, I'd be more inclined to believe him, but since he refused to do so, I am skeptical about the authenticity of that story. So far, I have yet to see anyone other than James Renner make these claims about Maura's alleged promiscuity, and I've reached out to Baghdadi in hopes he can clarify. It would appear that he was not involved in these late-night soirees, and that he was seeing Maura at a time where he understood their relationship to either be over or on hold. We hung out at the end of the semester in 2003, he told Renner. Then she went home for the summer. She visited him once in Amherst over the summer, and then they stayed in touch over the phone and through email, but suddenly all of that stopped. I got this random email about her boyfriend, he said. They had started things back up. She left whatever we had. Part of the reason I'm skeptical of Renner is that several times I noticed him making deceiving statements in his book. For example, in chapter 47, he says the story Fred told a searcher named Rick Graves didn't line up with the story in the newspapers about the night she crashed Fred's car. Renner goes on to quote Graves as saying, when Maura drove to Fred's motel that night, the manager called Fred's room and told him to come to the lobby. Fred told me that when he got there, he found Maura slumped over a chair crying. He never told me what she was crying about, but nothing about that conflicts with what Fred told the papers. And Renner doesn't actually explain how he feels it's contradictory. And while I didn't include it in the quote, he straight up says Fred lied about what happened with the police. And as I said, he does not explain that. Anyway, another instance of what I considered to be misrepresentation came with the chapter about Kate Markopoulos, who he described as being obstinately silent during his attempts to get information from her. Leaving aside the fact that Renner was basically harassing anyone who wouldn't speak to him in order to write a book that Maura's family explicitly told him they didn't want him to write, the way he talks about his eventual conversation with Kate is just weird. Again, self-proclaimed gonzo journalist. Anyway, the quote, Kate provided a lot of inconsequential details, he writes. She and Maura liked watching Bottle Rocket, a movie about a couple of friends who steal some money and then go into hiding until they're caught by police. They often went shopping together. Now in the business, we call this priming the reader, because the very next set of details are only inconsequential if you're looking to ignore evidence against your own case. Maura was planning to move to Oklahoma to be with Billy, Kate told him, but she wasn't thrilled about moving. It was the middle of nowhere. She was going to get a job at a hospital. She was going to move because she loved him. Additionally, Kate said that Maura and her father had a fantastic relationship and that she loved him very much. So, one of the only people close to Maura at school said she had a great relationship with her father, that she loved her boyfriend, and that she was planning to move to Oklahoma, but that's irrelevant somehow. That's an inconsequential detail. Absolutely none of those things are inconsequential, considering what Renner is trying to argue. I mean, his entire argument so far hinges on the idea that she was trying to run away from her life, and yet Kate directly told him she liked her life. Now, to be fair, Kate did allegedly tell Renner, the more I think about it, the more I realize I didn't really know her, but that doesn't mean she somehow misunderstood every single thing about a girl she spent about 20 hours a week with. The other part that bothers me about the chapter is the end, where Renner describes how he reached out for some clarification about who was present at Sarah's dorm party the night before Maura disappeared. Kate replied via email, writing, I understand it would be helpful if I could remember names, but it is just not happening. It was long ago, and I barely knew these people, nor would I see some of them again. Renner writes, that last sentence is hinky. Nor would I see some of them again? Which of them did she see again? Thing is, that statement isn't hinky at all. It was a party at a large state college. If you've ever been to one of those, chances are you have crossed paths with people you never saw again. The ones she did see again were probably her friends, like Sarah, whose dorm room the party was in. Renner attended Kent State University, so I can't imagine he doesn't know this. Now, of course, it is possible that nobody was inviting James Renner to parties at Kent State University, and this is starting to make more sense. The real doozy, however, is the last sentence of the chapter. It wasn't until much later that I learned that Kate Markopoulos had a very good reason to avoid police and reporters. Now, you might be expecting that this line has a payoff later in the book. It does not. In my opinion, Renner was frustrated with Kate because she wouldn't confirm what Nast and Hussein had told him about Maura's promiscuity, something of which it would appear he was the first to inform Billy Roche. In chapter 56, Renner outlines a conversation he claims to have had with Billy. And off the bat, I noticed he quoted Maura's former boyfriend as saying that she got an honor code violation at West Point because she stole a granola bar from a store. Julie, however, said it was makeup. Next, he pointed out that Billy said the party that night happened off campus rather than at Sarah's dorm. And for some reason, Renner immediately used that to call Kate's version of the story into question. Occam's razor would suggest that Billy, who was in Oklahoma at the time, had his facts mixed up. Instead, Renner presents it as if it's proof that Kate was lying. The more interesting part of this conversation was about a printed out email allegedly found in Maura's dorm room when police searched it after her disappearance. According to Renner, Billy said that this was a letter that had to do with him seeing another woman, but that it was more complicated than the police let on. Billy said that the other woman was a girl he'd been dating before he met Maura, and that he'd reconnected with her in some capacity. The complicated part was that Maura and Billy were not together when he saw this old girlfriend again. In my opinion, however, the complicated part is Billy saying that this email existed in the first place, because it's the very same one Fred explicitly told Governor Lynch didn't exist. Not only that, but an article in the UMass Amherst student paper, the Daily Collegian, quotes Billy's own mother as saying, "There is no note." Furthermore, she said that Billy himself said there were no recent letters between the two of them found in the dorm room. Beyond that, Sharon never said a word about the couple having broken up at any point in 2003, but rather referred to a point where the couple's relationship was rocky in the spring of 2002. But they had resolved their problems by summer and had a good relationship since then. As far as she was aware, as far as Kathleen was aware, and as far as Fred was aware, Maura and Billy were on good terms when she disappeared. And the email she actually did send him that day suggested the same to be the case. This isn't to say that it's impossible that she and Billy were in some sort of rocky situation in 2004, or that Billy was necessarily the best kind of person. Some questions have been raised in recent years due to a criminal trial against Roche, which saw him convicted of misdemeanor simple assault in 2022. There also appears to have been a civil case against Roche in 2019, potentially brought by the same plaintiff, though the only reporting I can find on that comes from Renner, and he didn't give the name of the victim. What is certain is that Billy was very involved in the search for Maura Murray, and that he had an airtight alibi on the night she disappeared. Renner himself confirms he saw the call logs from Billy's phone, and was able to confirm that he was in Oklahoma, and there is simply no evidence to suggest that Roche somehow coordinated an attack against Maura. Even if he wanted to for some reason, how would he have known where she was going? I mean, that's the real question, isn't it? Where was Maura going? Why was she going there? When I started writing this episode, the thing that made the most sense to me was that Maura's arrest in November of 2003 might have something to do with it. The sentence for her crime, misdemeanor improper use of a credit card, in an amount under $250, carried a maximum sentence of 1 year in prison and a fine. But she was essentially let off the hook on the condition that she didn't get into trouble for 6 months. And though she wasn't given a sobriety test on the night she crashed her father's car, it could be possible she was worried that some other minor criminal charge might be headed her way, and that she panicked over the potential jail time that might bring. If that were the case, it would explain why she up and left so quickly, and why she printed out directions to a place she wasn't going. But does that really make sense? To leave behind an entire life and a loving family just to avoid the mere potential of being sent to jail for a year? In all likelihood, she'd have received community service and probation, and that was if charges were brought against her at all. And even if she had decided to disappear, would she have really done so without telling anyone at all close to her? I think the answer to that lies within a reframing of the question itself. Renner, Overacker, and many others who have covered the case have tried to account for the entire story as though Maura's decision to leave Amherst and her disappearance from Haverhill are directly connected. But I think that part of the reason this case is so confusing, and part of the reason it's never been solved, is that they probably aren't. Rather than being the mystery of why Maura wanted to disappear or how a killer lured her to the crash site, it's two mysteries rolled into one. There is the mystery of what happened to Maura Murray after that crash in New Hampshire, and there is also the mystery of why she left Amherst in the first place. I don't think that a serial killer is necessary to explain how Maura vanished, nor do I think that an intention to disappear is necessary to explain why she ended up on that road. In fact, I don't think Maura intended to disappear at all. I think she fully expected to return to Amherst, probably after about a week. I think that she meant it when she promised to call her father and boyfriend later that night, and I think someone else prevented her from doing so. Let's review the facts. Maura had been making erratic decisions in the days before she disappeared. She was drinking more heavily than usual, taking bizarre risks, and according to Renner's interviews with her teammates, she'd been unusually withdrawn since returning from winter break. She was crying at work and wouldn't tell anyone why. She told her boyfriend she didn't feel much like talking to anyone the day she disappeared. She then left without telling anyone where she was going, but did express that she would be gone for about a week. She packed a week's worth of clothes, her textbooks, birth control pills, a book to read, and most of the cash in her bank account. She printed out directions to northern Vermont, but didn't tell anyone, not even her family, why she was going there. And when she crashed her car, a car registered in her father's name, she asked witnesses not to call the police. To me, these aren't signs that she wanted to die or disappear forever. They're signs that she was trying to do something without her family finding out she'd done it. Maura's parents were Catholic. Her mother was a nurse and her father a traveling medical technician. Her boyfriend lived halfway across the country, and whether the rumors were true or not, their relationship definitely wasn't as stable as it could have been. Add in the fact that it was 2004 and the country was considerably more socially conservative than it is today, and I think the evidence points towards one very simple conclusion. Maura Murray was pregnant, and she was traveling to Burlington because she was planning to get an abortion. Now you may be thinking, but Aiden, wasn't abortion legal in Massachusetts in 2004? Yes, it was. But when your Catholic parents live in Massachusetts and work in the medical field, you might not want to take the risk that word could spread. Burlington has a Planned Parenthood clinic that I confirmed does provide abortion services, and Maura may have felt that her best chance to avoid anyone finding out about the procedure would be to have it done in another state far from any network her parents might be connected with. I believe this explains her decision to leave and her odd behavior in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. But it doesn't explain why she was on Wild Emmanusick Road, or how she ended up going missing from that location, but it may not need to. First, let's cover how she got so off track, because that question has been bugging me the entire time I've been looking into this case, and I do have to credit Renner for making me aware of a possible answer, though I of course confirmed that his reporting was correct before going this route. It seems that there was some overlap between the UMass track team and the UMass outing club, and the latter of those two has a cabin on Mount Agassiz, or Agassiz, I'm definitely getting this one wrong, outside of Bethlehem, New Hampshire. Maura may have been there before, or at the very least known of its existence through her friends, and could have been attempting to reach it in order to stay the night. The cabin is only about 22 miles from the crash site, and you can get to it from there by taking Route 112 east to Route 116. It's not the most direct route, but if it's getting late, and you only have a general idea of where you are, and your car is running on 3 cylinders, it's not out of the question to end up going that way. And as Sergeant Smith reported, evidence at the scene indicated that the vehicle had been eastbound and had gone off the roadway, struck some trees, spun around, and come to rest facing the wrong way in the eastbound lane. Her lack of familiarity with the road, as well as the darkness and the potentially icy conditions, could account for her taking the turn where she crashed too quickly, while the possibility that she was trying to get to the cabin could be why her scent trail led eastward. As for why she didn't wait for the police, she probably knew they'd try to book her for a DUI due to the open wine box. Whether she'd been drinking or driving or not, she was in a small town in another state with an open package of alcohol, and she probably would have known she wasn't getting off as easy as she had 2 nights prior. The alcohol she packed, including the bottles missing from the car, might have been her way of paying the outing club back for her stay at the cabin, or it may have just been for her to get through what was sure to be a stressful week. She also could have brought it along in hopes of trading it for a ride or lodging, but the point is that she had reasons not to leave it behind in the car, and she had a backpack in which to carry it. It's also possible that her decision-making was simply compromised due to a head injury sustained during the accident, so there's any number of reasons why she would have taken it with her and left the scene. From there, we have just one last question to answer. Where did she go? I think the most plausible answer is that she was abducted, either by a passing traveler or by somebody who lived in the area. There were no tracks leading off into the 2-foot-deep snow anywhere near the scene, dogs lost her scent from the middle of the road, and in 21 years, multiple searches have never turned up a body or even so much as an item belonging to Maura. Maybe those cadaver dogs did find something in that closet in 2006, or maybe the other team did in 2018. But if they did, it's on the New Hampshire State Police to perform a proper investigation. I won't be holding my breath on that, because they know it's easier to wait for Fred Murray to die. Maura's mother, her sister Kathleen, and her brother Fred Jr. have already departed this world, which means there aren't many people left to fight for Maura. Her sister Julie has in recent years taken up the mantle, and she is a force to be reckoned with, but she alone may not be able to force the authorities to do what's right. And if she does manage to get them to dig into those leads, but nothing comes of it, that could shut down any future investigations for good. As for who could be responsible for Maura's abduction, I don't feel comfortable speculating any further than her family already has. There are reasons to question Butch Atwood's story, but many already have, and nothing has come of it. The same can be said for the Westmans, who were a little too eager to get the Murrays to stop searching their property and those surrounding it, at least in my opinion, but there's no hard evidence that they did anything to her. Then there's the police, who seemed entirely disinterested at best and deceptive at worst. Were they incompetent? Were they lazy? Or were they deliberately sabotaging the investigation for some reason or another? The fact that they refused to bring in the FBI makes me think they were hiding something, and that at the very least they cared more about their egos than solving the case. But does that mean they're complicit? Without further evidence, it's impossible to say for certain. As I said earlier, I do think that that note posted on GeoCities is extraordinarily suspicious, and that whoever wrote it could very well be responsible for Maura's disappearance. However, that was posted 16 years ago. It appears that it was forwarded to the New Hampshire State Police, and while I do not believe for a second that they actually tried to look into it, it would be nearly impossible to track down whoever posted it now. So all we can say is that someone out there almost certainly knows what happened to Maura Murray. And whoever they are, it's time to come forward and finally give her family the peace they deserve. Now, I am sure there are going to be comments that are saying all sorts of things about me being wrong, and I am open to being incorrect. I'm going to reach out to Julie Murray and ask her if she'd like to come on the show and chat. I'm going to reach out to Greg Overacker again. Also, there are a couple of guys behind the podcast, Missing Maura Murray, I believe it's called. I'm going to see if I can get them to come on. I would genuinely love to talk to more people involved in investigating and covering this case, to see if I have any gaps, to see if they think I'm right about anything, and hopefully we can move the needle a little bit. I know that this case was dead in the water for a little while, but over the last few years, Julie Murray has been hitting it hard. We'd love to be able to help in any way that we can, so our platform is open to anyone who has information and is looking to share it. Now, if you would like to support what we do here at the Lore Lodge, there are a number of ways you can do that. You can check us out on Patreon for $1 a month. We've got some exclusive content over there and even more coming out. We just need to hire an editor so that Aiden can, not do all of it himself. And if you subscribe to Patreon, it'll actually help us do that. Right now, we feel that we're about one editor's salary away from being able to actually provide all of the stuff we want to provide, so subscribing to Patreon helps that happen. If you're looking for more material benefits, we do have our coffee. You can buy that from TableauRoastingCo.com. I designed it myself. I didn't just pick it off a shelf. We also have merch from Bunker Branding. It's so cozy. The links to all of that are linked in the description if you'd like to check any of it out, and we really appreciate it if you do. We also have our Discord server, which is also linked in the description. That's where you can get all of the updates for everything as it comes out. And if you're looking for more Lodge, you can check us out on History Unhinged, The Weird Bible, or my personal channel, Aiden Mattis, where I typically stream games on Friday, and I'm trying to get back into doing some commentary streams. And of course, there is our live show, which is Monday nights at 7 p.m. Eastern, unless it's not, and if it's not, we'll let you know when it is. So, with all that said, thank you for watching. Let me know if I got anything wrong. Let me know if I got anything right, and we'll see you next time. I'm Aiden Mattis, and thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.